The United States in the mid-19th century was a rapidly developing country, but deep divisions were growing within it. The North, industrial, urbanized, with factories and railways, opposed slavery and advocated the development of a modern economy. The South, agricultural, with large cotton and tobacco plantations, depended on slave labor. Slavery was not only the economic, but also the cultural foundation of the South. This difference sparked decades of debate. Should new states joining the Union be free or slave-owning? Could the federal government restrict slavery? Did states have the right to decide their own fate? In 1860, Abraham Lincoln, a member of the Republican Party, which opposed the spread of slavery to new territories, became President of the United States. For the South, this was a warning sign. They feared that Lincoln would abolish slavery altogether. In December 1860, South Carolina announced its withdrawal from the Union. 6 other states followed suit. They formed a new state, the Confederate States of America, headed by President Jefferson Davis. In Washington, this was considered a rebellion and treason. Lincoln did not recognize the right to secession. He believed that the Union must remain united. On April 12, 1861, Confederate troops opened fire on the federal Fort Sumter in South Carolina. This was the first battle, and it marked the beginning of the Civil War. The country was divided. On one side was the North, or the Union. On the other was the South, or the Confederacy. The North had the advantage in industry, transportation, and population. The South had experienced officers and strong motivation. They were fighting for their way of life. The early years were chaotic. The Union hoped to quickly suppress the uprising, but the first major battle at Bull Run, July 1861, ended in defeat for the North. Then Union General Ulysses S. Grant launched a successful offensive in the West, capturing the strategic Tennessee and Mississippi rivers. In the East, Confederate General Robert Edward Lee won victories in Virginia, demonstrating his talent as a strategist. The year 1862 was a turning point. In September, near the town of Antietam, Maryland, the bloodiest single-day battle of the war took place, with over 22,000 dead and wounded. Lincoln used this battle as an opportunity. On January 1, 1863, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared all slaves in the Confederate States free. The war, which began for unity, turned into a war for freedom. In 1863, both armies clashed in the Battle of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It was a decisive battle. 3 days of fierce fighting, with over 50,000 casualties. The North's victory stopped Lee's advance and changed the course of the war. It was here, a few months later, that Lincoln delivered his famous Gettysburg Address, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. By 1864, the Union began to gain the upper hand. General William Sherman carried out his legendary March to the Sea, from Atlanta to Savannah, destroying the Confederacy's infrastructure to break its will to resist. In the East, Grant waged a grueling campaign against Lee, advancing on the Confederate capital of Richmond. By the spring of 1865, Southern forces were exhausted, resources were depleted, and armies were disintegrating. On April 9, 1865, General Robert Lee surrendered to Ulysses Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The war was over. A few days after the victory, on April 14, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in a theater by John Wilkes Booth, a fanatic from the South. The country celebrated the end of the war, but lost its leader. The Civil War became the bloodiest in U.S. history, with over 620,000 deaths. However, it changed the country forever. Slavery was abolished. 13th Amendment to the Constitution of 1865. The unity of the United States was preserved. No state had the right to leave the Union anymore. The Reconstruction of the South began, a complex and painful process of integrating former slaves into society. However, racial inequality, discrimination, and violence remained part of American reality for a long time. The Civil War in the United States is a story about how the country went through the hardest test to understand who it was. It was a war between brothers, between the ideals of freedom and the traditions of oppression, between the past and the future. Abraham Lincoln said, "If slavery is not evil, then nothing is evil." This war proved that freedom and equality are not just words in the Declaration of Independence, but principles worth fighting for,